All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Um, just a very brief introduction to me and why I'm talking about this kind of subject. I was adopted by private adoption in the UK in 1970. And it's that very fact and my experience that sort of, this is the very, very brief version that has led me to where I am in terms of what I do today and the work that I'm doing. I currently am working as a psychotherapist, and all of this research and findings around the well-being of adults who were adopted is very, very important to me. And that's a little bit about me, but this session is not about me, but I just wanted you to know, sort of who I am and where I'm coming from, I guess, as regards this kind of topic and the content. A brief disclaimer, which I always say, that anything that is mentioned in my presentation is not meant to in any way point any finger of blame. One thing you very quickly learn as a therapist / counsellor is that 80% of the content of our sessions with whoever involves family and parenting. And so talking about some of the things I want to talk about is, as I said, in no way meant to point finger of blame. My job is merely to sort of try and understand how it is that we might have come to the place that we find ourselves in as adults today. So with that said, very quickly want to say thank you to Claire for her wonderful session. It certainly helped me to feel a lot calmer. I want to say thank you, to all of you for coming today. One of the things that has been sorely lacking from a personal point of view was sorely lacking in my own life is that sense of community and understanding that there are others out there who may be experiencing what you do feel and experience on a regular basis, but not knowing that that exists. One of the basic needs of the human is that of validation, that to be seen and heard and validated by others. For me, that's not the same as wallowing in our grief and in our pain and becoming a victim of it, but it is certainly, part of it is certainly for that to have been acknowledged, and validation is major. And so you may not have considered that actually your attendance here today validates everybody here. The fact that you're all here is validation to every single one of us, really, and lets us know that we're not alone, and the things that we've experienced in our lives have been and are being experienced by others. So thank you for that. Around 18 months ago, I started a little YouTube project because my research led me to understanding what are the things that detract or add to the attainment of well-being in adults who are adopted. As we know, the narrative that's currently prevailing is very naive, and really people don't get it, frankly, they don't get it. So my aim with that channel was to just kind of get those findings out there to help people to very slowly understand the struggles of adoptees, not because we want to be victims, but because we need to be seen and we need to be heard. And we don't need to fight for validation. Nobody should need to do that. But to get to the point, not a week goes by without that I receive emails from people. Some of those emails are long and some of those emails are very short. But all of those emails have those two words, thank you, in them. And what I see in those words is feeling validated. That's how I interpret those words, because that's never happened for very many of us. My work in terms of trying to bring this message out and talking to people about the struggles of adoptees is met at best with confusion and bewilderment, and at worst with anger. And I feel, this is a narrative that needs to be changed. And as I say, that's my purpose. It's not going to happen in my lifetime, but this is something that is really, really important to me and matters to me, that generations of the future shouldn't have to fight to be seen and heard. Here's a story. This one will make you smile, or perhaps not. I had a conversation with somebody. He was an elderly gentleman quite recently, whose late wife was adopted. And he meets me with confusion and bewilderment. He's well-meaning, but sadly naive and uneducated, as are most in this regard. And he told me of the story of his late wife, whereby when she was young, she was having a conversation with her adoptive family. And the mother in particular said to her, "Do you have any desire to meet your real mother, your birth mother," I think was the term they used. And that child turned around to the mother and said, "No, mum, no, mummy, you're my real mother." And this was relayed to me by this but well-meaning gentleman. And in that moment, a million thoughts went through my head, too many to be processed properly in that moment. I responded with no words, silence, because we all have a story, and we all have something that we tell ourselves. And how do we know that that question was coming from a good place? It might have been coming from a good place. We don't know that. That question might have been coming from a fearful place in that adoptive parent. The response might have been coming from a fearful place in that child. Rejection, fear. So what we see isn't always what's really going on. But the point is that what I'm going to talk about today is something that is one of the lesser known and lesser discussed aspects of being an adoptee. They're all little spoken of. In my view, they're not talked about anywhere near enough. But of course, you know, as with all things, it's only when it really matters to you that you put the effort into talking about these things and finding these things out. But it's one of the lesser known aspects of being adopted, and that is that of adoptee guilt. So bear with me on that, because you know, we all have our own story, right? We all have our own experience of the world, and we all experienced our adoptions differently. We all experienced our lives differently. But this is a common thread. That said, it may not be something that you personally have experienced, or it may be that something that you have noted that you've experienced and never really put the words to it. But why guilt? Well, listen to this. I was working as a therapist once, as an adoptee, in my neutral position as a therapist. That's what we do. We bring our neutral selves and we put ourselves in the life and in the experience of the client. It's called mentalization, and that's what we do. But what we have to notice is when we are with clients and when things come up, that we bracket them, we notice them, and we put them away to one side. One particular session, there was this lady who was unable to conceive. And I'm not taking away the experience of that. That's very, very painful, as some of you may have experienced yourselves. I certainly did. It changed in the end, but there was a long period of time where I felt I wasn't going to be able to conceive. And it's a painful journey, so I would never want to take that away. But many parents arrive at adoption through this journey. They arrive at adoption because they can't conceive. So what happens is they get to that point where they decide they'd quite like to adopt a child. Now, this is where it gets really complicated, because there's a whole lot of things going on here. There's adoptee feelings that we are pre-verbally unaware of our experiences. There are the needs of the adopting parents and what you, the adoptee, brings them, and the needs that they have of you. So where am I going with this and about the guilt? Well, let's just say that they're traumatized themselves. They can't conceive. Their family, their story that they've had in their whole life about creating a family has been wiped out by the inability to conceive. So now you become the answer to all their problems, possibly. This is where the problems start. So do they try to love you as their own? Do they want you to be the baby they could never have? what kind of pressures is that putting on you? What layers does that hold within it? And how difficult is that for us as adoptees to respond to in a healthy way? So here's a problem, because it's very much about the story that we all tell ourselves. So you take this child in, you want to love it as your own because there's so much is riding on it. Your whole life, you've expected that you were going to have your own child, and now last ditch attempt, last chance saloon, here's this baby. But, so many families are completely unaware of the problems that brings. And so what happens? Well, we have an imbalance straight away. The child has attachment and bonding complications in many cases. Our attachment issues are as a direct result of a separation. We have unprocessed trauma, separation anxiety, and that is something that is primal. That bond to the biological mother is a primal bond, which is severed. We're dealing with unprocessed trauma and loss without even knowing about it. It's all very well later on we learn about this stuff and we can talk about it and go, oh yeah, that's why I did that, or that makes a lot of sense. I know from my perspective, I had a physical knot in my stomach many, many, many years. There was a sense of something just being off. And I didn't know what that was. I couldn't put words to it. I definitely couldn't label it. But all of these things were going on for me. So the attachment issues, the trauma, the loss and the grief, the families are not aware of this. So their narrative ignores it. So they're bringing you in good faith, let's say, and I know that's not the case for everyone, but this is just what I'm talking about here today, is this family that is doing this in good faith, in ignorance, but good faith, ignores all of these things. And so we've got this issue whereby we're trying to deal with all of this. We need to be able to heal from all of this to move forward. But there's no narrative, there's no open conversation in the family about any of these things. And then on top of that, we recognize that there's something that's not quite, there's something that you can't quite put your finger on about how you feel about the people that are around you. You're in an environment that feels alien. There's something that's off, that knot that, certainly I carried for many years, that just alerted me to the fact there was something that was off and I couldn't say what it was. But people were not saying to me, which is what my research has found, hey, what's it like for you? How does this feel for you? What's it like being the only one at school? What's it like trying to come to terms with who you are as a person, your identity? And again, not pointing a finger of blame. They had no knowledge, absolutely none. But the inability to be within that family, within that household, in the way that is expected of you, brings about, on top of all those other feelings, a sense of guilt, which many of us have carried all of our lives. So when we talk about unrequited love, we hear about it in other sort of contexts in a way, but you can sort of say, well, I don't feel the same about that person, and often you can sever that bond. Adoptees and relationships, that's a whole big topic, but it may not be so easy for an adoptee to sever that bond. But, in simple terms, if you don't really like someone that much, or you realize that you don't love them very much, you kind of stop hanging around with them. Not so much in the adoptive family environment, because there is a sense of something else. Of course, we may love them, actually. We may care for them. Usually that would be the case, unless there's something disturbing that's unfolding within the family. But it's a very complicated, toxic mix of emotions. And that results in fear and guilt, because you can't walk away. Most people need their families, which is something that, becomes such a big topic in our lives, in our psychological disturbances, how we are with our families, because walking away is the hardest thing for anybody to do. Trust me, I've worked with enough people, and I know that very often it's probably the most sensible thing, but doing it is a whole different matter. So we're left with all these complicated feelings. As I said, my research showed that open communication about the feelings and the inner thoughts of the adoptee is something that has helped adults to achieve well-being. It's something that helps them to normalize their experiences. And in my view, this didn't come out in my research, but guilt ought to be part of that. It would be really interesting, as far as I'm concerned, to see whether, if there's an open narrative around the struggles of the adoptee, that guilt is then lessened for adults who are adopted. We don't know. But as I say, my experience shows me that we may be sort of limited in terms of how we can return the love. It's not in the same way as A, I think, is expected, and B, if we've got other siblings within the house, you know, the way they respond to the parents. And that again layers up the guilt and the complicated feelings. So the genetic bond is a very powerful one in terms of evolutionary psychology. We know that that's there by design. Okay, so any of you who've got kids, you know that you will do whatever you can within your power to protect them, to do everything for them. That is there by design, to protect the species. Okay, so straight away we've got this kind of difference. And offspring, biological offspring, have an inexplicable bond to the parent. Again, I know if we're working with caregivers who have a terrible burden, if you like, but you wouldn't do that for anyone else. Many of these people wouldn't do what they were doing for anyone else other than their parents. So where does that leave us? You know, where does that leave people who don't have this genetic bond with their parents or with their family? It's a really super interesting area to me. As I say, this bond is there by design. It's to protect our species. What we see often is that generally the feelings are not quite the same. You know, through divorced families, we see that, you know, even fairy tales talk about the wicked stepmother, right? So this kind of like replacement mother, if you like, it's a very loaded and complicated subject area. What we see, though, is super interestingly, and again, no, please don't take this the wrong way, but when the biological mother isn't present for whatever reason, or is not in the children's lives for different reasons, then the step family gets along better. Now, I have a theory that maybe that's because the children tell themselves a different story. The stepmother has a different story. She's now able to step into the role of mother in a different way. So I wonder if this is what's happening with adoptees and the adopting parent. You know, they adopt the child, they are the mother. That's unhelpful for us because we have a whole load of stuff that we have to deal with that they're unaware of. All right. So that's where I find it's really interesting, because studies show that you can't naturally have the same degree of love, regard, if you want to call it, affection towards non-biological as you do to your biological. And yet many adopting parents do report feeling that strength and not differentiating between their children, biological and adopted. And I personally say, as I say, I personally believe that's because they feel like the mother, right? They want to be. So they haven't adopted that child with a narrative of that child is someone else's, or that child comes predisposed to having certain struggles and issues. I hope all of this makes sense. Obviously, if you've got any questions, you can stick them in the chat at the end. But the big problem comes when the lack of knowledge around this means that the parent expects this. Okay, this is where the bond starts to break down, and we see what they sometimes call failed adoptions, or, you know, difficulties within the relationships within the home, that kind of thing, because the parent's completely unaware that this child is going to struggle to give them what they need. as individuals and as adopted people, we may be very aware, as I say, even pre-verbally, there's a sense that something's not the same, you know. So, and we pick this up, don't we? I think we pick this up from the parent that has the need that we're unable to fulfill. It's very heavy. It's very, very heavy. And again, I'm not blaming the parent. It's not their fault. They just didn't know. But, you know, as I say, I'm not in the job of adoptive parent bashing. I'm just in the job of trying to explain why we feel the way that we feel, right? And we're falling short of our duties, you know, not when the going gets tough, when they get sick, or when they are in need, you know, there may be, for many of us, an inability to mobilize ourselves, an inability to do something about that in the same way that you might if that was your parent. So you live your whole life feeling guilty about not being the one that you know your parent wanted. And then there's that all-important word, gratitude. How toxic and how multi-layered, you know, should we be feeling grateful? Well, no, hell no. But of course, on some level, we are very multi-layered, and there might be, based on our likely outcome otherwise, some sense of gratitude. Again, complicates the whole thing. So one of my favorite books written by an adoptee, Betty Jean Lifton. I think it's Betty Jean. I think I've written that wrong. Lifton, Memoirs of an Adopted Daughter, touches on many things in her book. The first time I read it, I mean, my highlighted pen just got completely run out, you know, because every single time I turned the page, there were paragraphs just being highlighted and highlighted. And it was like, wow, it kind of goes back to that validation that I was speaking about earlier, is to just see that another person has experienced the same things as you is so, so, so powerful. And it is for that I am so happy, you know, to have you all here today. She says this: she was asking from me something she could not articulate and which I could not give. And we each had our roles and we continued to play them. I resented this woman who was my mother by a fluke of fate and a legal decree, but a primitive love still held me to her. Or was it guilt or gratitude? The Japanese speak of the debt that can never be repaid. That's what held me to this mother, a child's helplessness in his debt. I mean, wow, right? And well, we never pick any of this stuff either, did it? You know, it's just all happened to us. How heavy, right? So the result is that it adds to the already difficult and challenging trajectory of adjustment that an adoptee has. You know, we've got to deal with all those things. The inadequacy, which I don't think we have any reason to, but even the most aware of us on a very basic level question our adequacy as a human, because we had to be given up by the very person that should, in an idealized fairy tale world, keep us to the end of their days and fight tooth and nail to do so. You know, so we question ourselves, right? And I think this adds to that sense of inadequacy. It takes us further inwards. You know, we've already got a difficult job trying to adjust, especially with the lack of understanding and accepting narrative around us. And so having to cope with additional feelings about other people's well-being is pretty unhelpful. It can result in anxiety. And as Claire touched on earlier in the tummy, anxiety manifests itself in lots of different ways. For some people, it's their chest and palpitations. For others, it's a heaviness in the belly. It comes in all sorts of different ways. But one of the most toxic things to experience is resentment. And resentment usually comes from not being able to express or explore these things in open and forgiving and understanding conversation. Okay, so that's the main point. It's being able to express some of these feelings without fear of anger or rejection from the parent, because of course rejection is the number one, isn't it? So the parent ends up feeling like they've done something wrong. They can't quite understand it all, questioning their own skills as parents, saying things like, but I love you with all my heart. Oh, okay, well, there's way more to being a parent of an adoptee. And that's where it all gets kind of complicated, isn't it, really? Because it's not about making allowances for those who are adopted, but it is about parenting them differently with the understanding of the fundamental struggles that an adoptee has. So really, it's unhelpful for everyone involved, you know, and that's why it's so important, because there's so much pain that happens. The pain manifests in all sorts of different ways. You end up maybe arguing, falling out. I mean, goodness me, the amount of arguments and fallouts I couldn't even tell you that happened over the years. And, you know, things are said in pain and anger, you know, what would have become of you? We did a good thing. Why do you not feel like that about us? How is this our fault? Do you feel like you wish you'd been adopted by another family? You know, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what goes on for the adoptee. They could be the most perfect family in the world, as I say very often. The struggles would be the same. The fact is, I say the same. There may be additional struggles. I'm not going to discount those who've had particular issues within the family, but, you know, fundamentally, there's a primal need to be with the biological mother. All right, that life may have been inferior. That might have been a difficult, harder life. But I do not know why my PowerPoint presentation is just running ahead of me, which is a bit of an annoyance. But we do want fundamentally to be with that person. It's not about money. It's not about lifestyle. It's not about a good education or any of those things. There's a need to be with the biological parent. And that's hard for many to accept. Later in life, when we sort of go through reunion, we might find that we don't really get along with them that well, actually. There's nothing that has bonded us together, but I'm talking about the basic needs that humans have upon coming into this earth. So yes, as the next slide already showed you, you know, the difficulties that arise from that are the communication difficulties between the parents, the siblings, bad feelings that are becoming toxic. Oh my goodness, this is really annoying. Sorry, guys. Drifting, distancing, moving away, and I mean physically as well, like geographically moving away. There can be all sorts of side effects of this problem. The imbalance of the relationship. Fundamentally, I think this sentence sort of sums it up. It's like, because of their story that they've told themselves when they've adopted you, you're theirs. And I'm saying theirs. Often, you know, it's a single parent. I recognize that. But you're not. You're theirs, but they're not yours. And so there's the imbalance, right, that can come up. So what's the answer? Well, for those of us who are already adults, it's acknowledgement of this fact, understanding that it's okay, that we have to be able to forgive ourselves if we can't return those feelings in the same way, because after all, this is our story, one that we did not choose. Attempt open communication with the family if that feels safe enough to do so. For many, that's not the case. It's the story of our parents that may get challenged by opening up this conversation. That was certainly my case, is that you're challenging their view of themselves, right? By saying, this is where my needs weren't being met. Future adoptees, that's obviously a lot easier to sort of simple terms say, we need to educate, because those conversations can then happen. That child can then exist authentically with all their complicated and complex feelings. That child can then have those conversations in a way whereby the parent is not judging them and is not rejecting them because of it. Because in an ideal world, they'll be aware of it beforehand. They'll go into the adoption knowing that, okay? You're not flawed, you're not broken, you have limitations because of your experience of having been adopted. Healing is all the same things that we normally say: journaling, yoga, mindfulness, conversation, poetry, lyrics, therapy, all of the above, all of the things that are mentioned on there are the things that we need to consider giving ourselves, because it's such a heavy burden to carry. And so Claire's introduction into the day on yoga and then meditation, that thing of being still, connecting with your true and inner and authentic self, forgiving yourself first and foremost, and then maybe dealing with it in some way outwardly if you feel that's appropriate to do. But number one is just being kind to yourself. I do just want to say at this point, the adoption triad and all of those involved is a very complicated and complex setup, really. The guilt is not just limited to us as adoptees. I had an email very recently from a lady who is struggling with her guilt every single day. And her guilt is because her adopted daughter, who's now an adult, is struggling with her mental health, as so many of us do. And she now is aware of all of this, but she wasn't at the time. She wasn't at the time when she was bringing up her daughter. And her feelings around that guilt of not being able to have acknowledged that for her daughter as she was bringing her up was eating her alive. And my advice to her was the exact same. You've got to be kind to yourself. We are all operating within the limits that we have at the time. I would say, I hope that you have found this validating. One of the main points is to be validated by some of this. As I say, it's just having other people say, maybe you felt like that, maybe you didn't, but if you did, it's okay. Just take some notes, perhaps discuss it in the breakout session. Make sure that you feel safe enough to do that. Let one of us know if you feel unsafe. We would encourage you to kind of talk about the things that, that come up for you in that. I hope you found that useful, enlightening. I don't know. It's one of those things that we can talk to each other about and probably get. Other people may not get it at all. And that's where there's a lot of work to be done. But look, I'm happy to take questions. So I think we've got 10 minutes-ish for that.